Hi, I'm Roz Carter, and I'm an author, a book coach, and an editor. And today I'd like to revisit a topic that we talked about a few weeks ago, and that's my retelling of A Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. This year I'm doing a challenge where I write one short story per month. And for February, the short story I chose was to do a retelling of A Telltale Heart. So let's talk about it. So, one of the things that I wanted to do with my retelling was to place it in the universe, the story universe that I've worked with other stories. And so I wanted to place it with my witches that I've been writing about for the past 10, 11 years now. So when I thought about doing the retelling for A Telltale Heart, I thought, what if I made the protagonist a witch? And what if I placed her in my witch academy? Maybe she's one of the instructors. So with that idea in mind, I had the story framework that I knew I was going to use with the Telltale Heart, and I knew the type of character that I wanted to use with my Witch Academy. So I chose one of the instructors that I've written about in the past in another book, and I quickly wrote a zero draft of the story. And this was done in one sitting. Just to give you a recap, I wrote a zero draft in one, really just to tell myself the story, to see what it was that I wanted to say, right? Because I knew I had this framework that I to work with, which might seem restrictive to some people, but actually it's very freeing because you know how the story should start. You know what's supposed to happen in the middle. There's a murder. And you know how it's supposed to end. But even with knowing the beginning, the middle, and the end, you have so much freedom to interpret the story the way that you want. And because I knew I wanted to work with these characters, I also had the ability to put in magic if I wanted to. So I wrote the retelling in one sitting and I said, okay, great. Now, what do we have? What do I have here? Is this a story yet that I feel comfortable with? So then we go on to the next part, which is where I am now. For the next part, what I've done is used a storytelling framework called Freytag's pyramid. And so with that framework in mind, what I wanted to do, even though I know that A Telltale Heart has it fits into a framework, I wanted to see if my retelling would fit into Freytag's framework, Freytag's pyramid framework. So that's what I did. I then chose each of the sections in my short story in my zero draft, and I plotted it into each of the 7 stages that exist in Freytag's pyramid. And I'll go over the actual stages in the next part of the video. So as promised, I said we would talk about Freytag's pyramid. And just to review, Gustav Freytag was a German playwright, and he designed or adapted this narrative structure. And his original structure had 5 steps. This one has 7 because we're including the exposition, the inciting incident, and the resolution and the final resolution. So it jumps from 5 to 7 steps. But just to go over how I've used Freytag's pyramid, again, I'm going to say Freytag or Freytag in this video. It will change. Just to use Freytag's pyramid as I've applied it to my short story idea, which is itself a retelling of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. So, stage one is the exposition. And again, the exposition, that's, our introduction into Act One. And in this one, I'm giving a little bit of background on their normal life, the protagonist's normal life. Who she is, how she normally spends her days, and how it's going up until the inciting incident, which is the next stage. Again, this is not included in Freytag's original step, but I've included it here as the step because I wanted to make sure that I got the exact inciting incident down in my short story as I extracted it from the original telling of the tale. So for my inciting incident, I labeled that as on the 8th day of her husband's jaw clicking, Lynette snaps and kills her husband, right? Spoiler alert. So that's the inciting incident to the entry into this story. So if that's the inciting incident, what in the world is the rising action? That's when Lynette is starting to have uh, she's starting to have to cover up her cover her tracks, right? So this is where there are obstacles in her path to bliss, right? She has this moment of bliss when thankfully the clicking has stopped, but now she has to do something with the body. Okay, which she has left sitting in their living room. He is sitting in his favorite chair. So that's my rising action for this story. Stage four, the climax of the story. What in the world is going to happen in the climax? Well, this is the start of the third act in the short story. So what has to happen? It's a turning point, right? Like every climax, it's a turning point. So for Lynette, you know, she is ready to give her crow friends their treat, which is his heart. And so that's going to be a turning point because now she has all of these crows that are gathered on her porch and in her front yard. But she's still hearing the clicking. And that's where I'm going to change it a little bit from where my original idea of a beating heart. I think she's just going to continue to hear clicking and she's not going to ever be able to escape it, right? So that's my turning point. That's my climax to the story. So then, okay, we get the climax. Now we have to go into falling action. So this is the other step in Freytag's pyramid. This is actually what a lot of writers consider Act Four in this story structure, this narrative structure. So Act Four, or falling action, is supposed to give a little bit of foreshadowing to how this story is actually going to end. How is this going to end for Lynette? The crows have actually gathered her fellow witches to her front yard because of the loud sound early in the morning. And if it's foreshadowing that I'm concerned with, what I want to make sure that I cover in this stage is how hopeless Lynette's situation really is. She's killed her husband in order to stop the clicking, and yet she still hears the clicking. And in some instances, it gets louder depending on where she is. And so she's trying to get the other witches to realize that what she's experiencing. So she's
speaking loudly. She's not overtly saying, "Can you hear it? Can you hear it?" But she's giving every indication that she is still being tortured by the sound of the clicking. So what happens next, right? Well, this is the start of the final act. And again, I've broken this up. I'm going to resolve the story in stage 6, and then there's going to be a final resolution in stage 7. So here in stage 6, I'm really getting into what Lynette is experiencing, how her sanity really is breaking. And I think that Freytag's pyramid really does well with a spiral, a downward spiral. So I've explored in this section really what she's experiencing in the moment and how the other people, the other witches, are trying to help her in this moment, right? So again, we're in the falling action, there's stuff happening, but what we're seeing happening in the story really is her breaking. Even beyond, murdering her husband. Final stage, the culmination, the denouement of the story is what happens at the end. And this is where we finally feel the tension start to break. I have a very bare sketch here of how that's going to look in my story. But as I said earlier, I've had lots of ideas about how this is going to end, and I can't wait to get to the end of this story because I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to enjoy getting through this next draft. So my question to you is, how are you doing with your February short story if you've joined me on the challenge? And do you have any ideas about your story for March yet? I'm not quite sure which story I'm going to write for March, but I will keep you informed.
What do I do next? Next, I will take this slightly expanded version, which I'll call draft 1, that I've used for for the plotting in Freytag's pyramid. What I'll do next is I'll rewrite each stage. You might say, well, why do all of this? You know that the story works. There's really no need to actually try to plot it into a framework. Everybody knows this short story, the original by Poe. Why go through this exercise? Because I am always in pursuit of learning more about my craft. And so this exercise serves 2 purposes. It reinforces my familiarity with plotting, right? There's always something new to learn. I think I haven't consciously written a story using Freytag's pyramid, so I wanted to see how this short story, would fit into that framework. Would it work? Was there a better framework for this short story? I didn't know until I tried it. I think it works well. So there's a learning opportunity there too. I am, as I've probably mentioned before, I am a process person. So if I can learn a new process or refine my existing process, I'm all for it. And I get a story out of it. So what I'll do with the story, I don't know. It's always great to have more short stories that are attached to my universe, my story universe in some way. So I take that as a win. It's part of my challenge. I take that as a win. So all around, I'm very happy with this process. And like I said, the next step will be to expand on my story because I already have some ideas about how I want to make a few little changes to the story in order to give a little bit more backstory so we understand exactly why Lynette decides to commit this murder. I've made a couple of changes in the outlining section where I've explained uh, how it's not a heart beating that is driving her crazy. It's the sound of her husband's jaw clicking. Uh, I had an idea the other day for how to bring the crow into the story, not just at the end of the story as I have it in the zero draft, but also in the beginning of the story. I want to establish a relationship between Lynette, my protagonist, and this crow, which I think I will give the crow a name. There's another choice that I've made in the story not to ever name the husband, which has some, deeper significance, I think, to the story. In Poe's story, we don't learn the name of the old man or the protagonist. So it's also following along with that tradition. And so, yeah, there are ideas bubbling up for how I'm going to expand this story and make it more my own and make a few little changes. So stick with me and I'll give another update probably in the next couple of weeks. Until then, remember, done beats perfect. Let's write.